Hey everyone, I'm HarvestBuildDestroy, and this is a channel about RTS games. In this video, I want to talk about something we think about a lot in the Age of Empires community that I've never really heard discussed in relation to other RTS games. Then, I'm going to try and show how we can apply it to Starcraft Brood War. I'm not sure if there's an official technical term for this concept, but I'm going to call it segmenting your economy. Age of Empires 2 features a complicated 4-resource economy that's essentially impossible to balance perfectly. Because of this, we have to think about our economies in a bit of a different way than players of other RTS games. Let me give you an example. Just about any player above a certain skill level will know that in order to continually make archers out of a single archery range, you need to have 2 villagers chopping wood and 3.5 mining gold. Of course, you can't make half of a villager, so you have to round that up to 4. This is how we think about our economies in Age of Empires. If you know how many villagers are required per resource to sustain production of whatever combination of units you're making, you know that any villagers that you have gathering resources beyond that will be surplus, and that you can decide strategically where you want that surplus to go based on what you want to do in the future. But while this makes a lot of sense in a game with 4 resources, would segmenting your economy like this have any application in RTS games with a smaller number of resources, like Starcraft Brood War? I would argue that perhaps there would be, although its use might be more limited. To start with, I don't think it has much application as far as minerals are concerned. Given that you can only select 12 units at a time, and there's no convenient counter above each command center, nexus, or hatchery like in StarCraft 2, it's hard to tell exactly how many workers you have mining minerals once you get past a certain number. And even if you do know how many workers you have, it's still pretty difficult to calculate your mineral income. But I do think this concept might be useful in relation to Vespene gas. According to Wikipedia, gas is gathered at a rate of about 103 per worker per minute, meaning 309 gas per minute per saturated geyser. I've tested it myself in single player, and it seems to be more like 300 on the dot. After 4 minutes of gas collection, I had 1208 gas, and there's some margin of error based on when the SCV starts mining, so for the purposes of this video, I'm going to use the number 300. Using this number, we can calculate how many production buildings you can continually produce a given unit out of per saturated gas geyser. Before we start looking at the numbers, I should note that this concept is probably most useful to Terran, and to a lesser extent Protoss. Since Zerg use larvae instead of traditional production buildings, I don't think there's really any application for Zerg. So let's start with Terran. As far as I can guess, the main units this concept will be useful for are the siege tank and the science vessel, but it might also be useful to know these numbers for wraiths and battlecruisers. Barracks units don't cost enough gas to be worth calculating, and Valkyries, dropships, and Goliaths tend to be units you sprinkle in smaller numbers based on what your opponent is doing, rather than intentionally massing them. So let's take a look at how the math works. We know that siege tanks cost 100 gas and take 32 seconds to build. We also know that each worker mines about 100 gas per minute for a total of 300 gas per minute per saturated geyser. To start with, we'll divide 60 seconds by the 32 seconds required to build a tank, which gives us 1.875. This means that each factory can produce 1.875 tanks per minute. If we multiply that by the 100 gas each tank costs, we get 187.5 gas per minute, which will round up to 188 for simplicity's sake. This is the amount of gas it costs per minute to continually produce tanks out of a single factory. 2 SCVs will mine about 200 gas per minute, so you can consistently produce tanks from one factory for every 2 SCVs and still have about 12 gas per minute left over. So while you can't support constant siege tank production from 2 factories off of one base, you can support 3 factories off of 2 bases and still have a bit of gas left over. Interestingly, if we do the same math for Goliaths, we get 120 gas per minute. If we add that to the 188 gas per minute required to constantly produce siege tanks, we get about 308 gas per minute, which is just over what one saturated geyser produces. Admittedly, you won't necessarily actually want to spam Goliaths like this in terribly many situations, but these numbers might be useful for the purposes of designing all-ins. More relevantly, if we do the math for science vessels, we get 270 gas per minute, which is pretty close to the gas produced by a saturated geyser. Wraiths cost the same as siege tanks, but take a bit longer to build, so when we do the math, we get 158 gas per minute. 158 times 2 is 316 gas per minute, which is just over what a single geyser can produce, so as you may already know, you're going to have a bit of starport idle time with any 1-base 2-port Wraith play. Lastly, battlecruisers work out to 214 gas per minute, which is just over what 2 SCVs will mine. From this, we can see that with 3 saturated geysers, you can comfortably support 4 starports, and with 2 saturated geysers, you're just a bit short of being able to support 3 starports. It might be worth mentioning here that since depleted geysers return 2 instead of 8 gas, we can divide 300 by 4 to get the gas produced by a depleted geyser, which is about 75 gas per minute. If you happen to be on 3 bases and one of your geysers is depleted, that means your gas income is 675 per minute. If we divide that by 214, we get around 3.15, which means that you can comfortably support the production of battlecruisers from 3 starports with 1 depleted and 2 active geysers. Here's a chart with all the Terran numbers. Before we move on to Protoss, I should explain why I think this concept is probably more useful for Terran than Protoss. There are a couple of reasons why I would suggest this. The first is that Protoss tend to use the largest variety of different units in their compositions. While the bulk of a Protoss army usually consists of Dragoons and Zealots, Protoss players tend to sprinkle in smaller numbers of just about every other unit to support their main army. As a result, there just aren't as many situations where Protoss players will consistently be producing the same unit out of a building for long periods of time. Protoss players also don't need to spend any gas on their gateways, while Terran players do need to spend gas to make factories, since their core composition is mech more often than not. They usually want to dedicate the majority of their gas to tanks, and producing tanks requires a machine shop add-on, so they need to plan ahead. With that said, I'll give you the numbers for Dragoons and High Templar anyway. Dragoons have the same build time as tanks and cost half the gas, so if we divide 188 gas per minute by 2, we get the number for Dragoons, which is 94. It might be useful to know that you can sustain production of Dragoons from 3 gateways off of 1 geyser, particularly in PvP where it can be difficult to get a second base. High Templar have the same build time as Dragoons and tanks, but cost 150 gas, so if we multiply 94 by 3, we get 282, which is almost as much gas as a single geyser produces, and even more than science vessels, although you get more units in the same amount of time. Another way to think of this might be that if you're massing Archons, you can get just under 1 Archon per minute from a single gateway, and it will use almost all of the gas produced by a single saturated geyser. Zealots don't cost gas, and Dark Templar are generally used for harassment in small numbers, so I don't think their number is terribly useful. Same thing for the robotics facility. Observers and Reavers typically aren't produced en masse, and even if you are massing Reavers, you're also going to be making shuttles out of the same production structure, so the numbers aren't particularly useful. However, I do think the numbers for Stargate units might be useful. Like factories, starports cost gas, so you might want to know how many you can support based on your gas income. The most useful unit to know these numbers for is probably the Corsair, which costs 150 gas per minute to sustain. 150 times 2 is 300, so you can just barely support production of Corsairs from 2 Stargates off of 1 geyser. Scouts are, of course, terrible, so I'll skip those, but if we do the math for Arbiters, we get 208 gas per minute, which is just slightly more than 2 probes will mine. I'm not sure if that number has any specific use other than knowing how much gas income you have left for Dragoons, Observers, and High Templar in PvT, but there it is anyway. Lastly, when we do the math for Carriers, we find that they're surprisingly inexpensive in terms of gas, at around 170 gas per minute, which is less than siege tanks, because of the Carrier's long build time of 88 seconds. Interestingly, you can support Carrier production from 3 Stargates off of 2 geysers, and still have about 90 gas per minute left over. Similarly, you can support 5 Stargates off of 3 geysers, and with 1 depleted and 2 active geysers, you're just barely shy of being able to support 4 Stargates. Alright, before I wrap up, here are all the Protoss numbers. I'm not exactly sure how useful long-time competitive players will find any of this information, but seeing as the ASL has been experimenting with some less traditional maps, perhaps it might be useful for designing new builds on unfamiliar terrain. At any rate, these numbers could at least be useful for newer players who have gotten into the game since the release of Starcraft Remastered. Well, as long as they don't play Zerg, I guess. Anyway, that's all for this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider rating, commenting, subscribing, or sharing. See you soon.